Hello, this is Wiley from Learn to Barbecue. This video is all about BBQ binders. Do they work or are they just BS? The binders that we're going to review are the following. First, no binder. Second, just water. Third, yellow mustard. And last, olive oil. Now the environment that we'll be testing in. Location is just outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. Altitude is 7,199 feet. The temperature that water boils is 198 degrees Fahrenheit. No, it is not 212 degrees like it is at sea level. Higher altitudes mean less air pressure and water boils at a lower temperature. Humidity on the day of the test was 21%. Ambient air temperature was 67 degrees Fahrenheit. The grill was a Rectech RT680 with a new Wi-Fi temperature controller. The grill was set for 300 degrees Fahrenheit and maintained that temperature for the whole 3-hour cook. Now the cook. As we said before, grill temperature will be 300 degrees Fahrenheit for the full cook. Total cook time will be 3 hours. At 1.5 hours, or halfway through the cook, we will then foil the ribs. Besides the binder, no additional moisture or oil will be added. No spritzing. Also, no moisture will be used when the ribs are foiled. Now it's time to prepare the ribs. I found these rather large spare ribs at half price, and I tried to make sure they all weighed within 5% of each other. First step for the prep is to trim the ribs. Part of our collaboration requirement was the ribs would be St. Louis style ribs. And here's how I do it. First, feel for the end of the bone at the narrow end of the rack. Now slowly using the knife, find the space between the end of the ribs and the breastbone section. These ribs were partially frozen, so I had to lean on the knife to cut through. When cutting, always try to make the ribs into a perfect rectangle, with both sides being parallel. When you're done, you have a nice and very clean looking rack of ribs. Now discard the breastbone section and find that little flap of meat on the bone side of the rack. Now trim that down so the surface of the rack is even. Trim off the ends so the rack is completely symmetrical, like a perfect rectangle. Now it's time to remove the membrane. The ribs were still pretty cold, and a secret to pulling the membrane is the warmer the rack, the easier it is to pull. Using a butter knife, I find the end of the membrane, and then get a paper towel and slowly pull the membrane off. I then repeated this whole process till all 4 ribs were trimmed and ready for rub. The rub I am using is Montreal steak seasoning. It is really salt, pepper, and garlic with a few extra things thrown in, but no sugar. Another secret to adding rub to ribs is get a big foil pan and apply the rub in the pan so cleanup is really easy. I will be using the toothpick labeling system that Chris from Meat Cranium Barbecue used. This is number 1 and is the rub with no binder. Now on to number 2. I first spritz the ribs with water and then I add the rub. I could see that the salt in the rub was reacting to the water. On the other side, I then spritzed with water and then added rub. I then put 2 toothpicks in so the rack is properly marked. Now on to number 3 with yellow mustard. As you can see, I put it on real heavy, and I covered every inch of that rack. As I was doing side 2, I noticed just like the water, the salt was reacting to the mustard. I assumed the salt was dissolving and penetrating the meat. Rack was done and now properly marked. Last but not least, we now have the olive oil rack. Like the mustard, I put the oil on real heavy, making sure every inch is covered. When observing the olive oil, I noticed there was no reaction with the salt. It just sat there. This olive oil is pure, and it is not extra virgin. The advantage with extra virgin is it lacks any taste, so it will not affect the taste of the meat. As we mark the last rack, we now move on to the cook. I have had this grill for 6 years, and with a few modifications now holds temperature extremely well. Also in the middle of the grill, where the ribs are, is the sweet spot, so the ribs will all cook evenly, and I will not have to open the lid except once just to observe the ribs after 15 minutes. Here is after 15 minutes, and what I'm looking for is any changes in the rub. What I saw was 2, the water binder, and 3, the mustard binder, actually had moisture pools on top, while 1, no binder, and 4, olive oil, were dry. It has been 1.5 hours, and now we're going to foil. I use a large foil pan so I can mold the foil into a pocket so we don't lose any juices. Now this rib is number 1, the no binder rack, and it was pretty dry going into the foil. As you can see, no moisture is being added, and that will be the case for all 4 racks. I will also be sealing the ribs in the foil so no moisture can escape. I will now repeat the same process for all the racks. It now has been the full 3 hours, and it's time to see how these ribs did. They were so dry, they stuck to the foil, and there was no moisture at all in the foil. The ribs are definitely done, but dry. It does have a nice bark, but it is what's under the bark that counts. They slice like overcooked ribs, not falling off the bone, for they're just too dry to do that. Here I'm trying to find a decent rib to eat. Actually, not a bad tug. It's just too damn dry. On the positive, if they had been spritzed and given moisture when they were foiled, they would have been fine. Now number 2, the rack that used water as its binder. These ribs also stuck to the foil, but there was a difference. There was liquid in the bottom of the foil. The rib cut cleaner, had a nice smoke ring, and actually had a nice tug. Ribs still tasted a little overcooked, but was edible. Now the number 3 rack, yellow mustard binder. This one, the ribs did not stick to the foil, and there was some liquid. Not a lot of liquid, but there was a little liquid in the bottom of the foil. Ribs sliced mushy if overcooked. The bark was also mushy, and the taste was just not great. Now number 4, the olive oil binder. These ribs just look burnt. They did not stick, but they were beyond overcooked. I would have been better off with a saw after trying to cut into these ribs. These ribs had bark so hard you could hardly get to the meat. And when you did get to the meat tasted like charcoal. It was totally burnt. I am glad that part is over. Now on to the results. There was no true winner, but we did learn something. First place was good old water. Ribs were less dry, had a good tug, and actually were edible. Second place was mustard. Ribs were dry, but also they were mushy if overcooked. Could not taste the mustard, but not crazy about the taste, not sure why. Third place, no binder. Ribs were very dry and chewy. Tug was okay, but the meat was just too dry to enjoy. In last place was olive oil. The oil actually burnt the rib to the point that it tasted like charcoal. So what did we learn? First question, does a binder help the rub to stick to the ribs? The answer, no. In all 4 cases, the rub stayed on the ribs, including the one without a binder. Are water and water-based binders like mustard better than oil-based binders like olive oil? The answer, yes. Water reacts to the salt in the rub, and like a dry brine helps meat retain moisture. When meat is added to hot oil, its surface dehydrates, and the meat will dry out. Do binders work, or are they just BS? Based on the test results, binders are just BS, and some, like oil, can have a negative effect. So what is the best way to cook ribs based on the test results? If you want to help the rub, then spritz with water. It does not help it stick, but it helps the salt in the rub act more like a dry brine. You should also spritz with water every 30 minutes, making sure the ribs are retaining moisture. Halfway through the cook, foil the ribs using a 1/4 cup of water, or in my case, pineapple juice. When done, unfoil ribs and let them stand for 10 minutes so the bark can dry out.